Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth lecture of this module. And today we will be covering the topic of the coming of the Second World War, and also we will be focusing on the Holocaust. I take it this is this is material that you have been somewhat more familiar with. Um, but obviously keep your notes, view the PowerPoint at your own leisure, and uh, come up with questions that you have, and then that we can discuss in the tutorials. Now, what we will be doing today, I will pick it up from where I left it last week, and I will again offer a quick overview of the rise of Hitler to power and explain in greater detail the racial foundation, the racialized foundations of the Third Reich. Then I will move on to giving you an overview of the key events that led to the outbreak of the Second World War. After that, I will focus specifically on the so-called quote-unquote Jewish question and the solutions to the Jewish question that were proposed in Germany at the start of the war. And I will describe and explain what led to the systematic annihilation of 6 million Jews, a terrible event for which we reserve the term Holocaust, a terrible genocide. And I will then focus on different kinds of interpretation of this event. Now, what I wanted to start with is the quite remarkable turn of affairs in Germany within a decade from a marginalized political figure, Hitler, turned into the appointed minister, prime minister and president, effectively, in effect, chancellor, of the country, appointed by President Hindenburg. And that happened within a decade. And that goes on to show the extraordinary shock that German society suffered after the end of the First World War. I take it you're maybe familiar with the so-called Beer Hall Putsch. Beer Hall Putsch, yes, in November 1923, an attempted and failed coup by a marginal political organization headed by Hitler. After that, Hitler went into jail where he wrote Mein Kampf, and he managed from the end of the 1920s all the way through to the early 1930s to build a very successful and power-grabbing party, the Nazi Party. Now, in the readings, you can read a bit more on specifically the consolidations of the Nazis into power. Here I'm just offering an overview of the events. And what is important to note here, and that links up with our previous discussion of the rise of authoritarianism in Europe, is that Hitler was the Weimar Republic, the German republic following the First World War, based in Weimar, was quite dysfunctional. There were a lot of frictions between political parties. Instability was all over the place. At the same time, the global economic crisis took its toll in Germany, the rise of unemployment. So all these different economic, political, and social conditions created a climate whereby Hitler's message for economic sufficiency, the rise of what he would call the Third Reich, the idea that Germany had been cut off, various parts of the German national body had been cut off after the First World War, such as, for instance, Sudetenland, the the part of then Czechoslovakia for German populations, etc. So the economic and political instability created framework, a context whereby Hitler's message of extreme nationalism and was actually started gaining ground. And in a quite spectacular turn of events that I don't really have time to get into right now, the president of the German Republic appoints Hitler as chancellor in 1933 to resolve the deadlock. And shortly thereafter, Hitler's regime becomes dictatorial in the sense that elections are abolished and there is a purge of all the dissenting parties and views within Germany. One of the foundations of German Nazism, and we discussed a bit about this, just a reminder, is extreme racialism, a view of the world in terms of races, with the Aryan race being the purest race and the race that ought to prevail not only in Germany and across the world. And this had tremendous consequences because the extreme Aryanism of the Nazi Party also allowed Hitler to find a convenient enemy within, and this was the Jews. The Jews were signaled out as the most degenerate of the German citizenry. They were deemed to be second-class citizens, not even second-class citizens. And at the same time, Hitler, in various speeches and public events, marshaled out against what he would call Judeo-Bolshevism. The idea that Russia represented a threat, and at the same time the international capitalists, being quote-unquote Jews, also represented a threat to the German nation, and the enemy from within, the Jews, had to be rooted out. And what is extraordinary here is that 2 years after the consolidation of Hitler into power, what comes into law in Germany, and that has striking consequences, is a certain bouquet, if you will, set of restrictions that limit who can be a German citizen. So the idea of the pure race, the idea of the Aryan blood, here is come to be firmly tied in with claims to citizenship. And those who are not deemed by the regime to be of Aryan blood, such as the Jews, are deprived of their citizenship status. And this has massive repercussions. It's the first kind of moment where everyone in Germany and outside Germany understands the severity of the Aryan ideology that underpins the Nazi regime. As I said earlier, German Jews were excluded from citizenship, were prohibited from marrying non-Jewish Germans, and sexual relations between German Jews and Germans and other German citizens become criminalized. What is interesting here is that how is the German Jew defined? Not simply as a matter of faith. The Jews in Germany by the Nazi regime are not considered to be a religious community, but they're considered to be a degenerate race. And for some historians, and some historians have argued that the Nazis developed a distinct form of anti-Semitism, which was quite unique and violent. Here I need to remind you that anti-Semitism is not something that it was invented by the Nazis. Anti-Semitic motifs, the Jew, the figure of the Jew being the outsider in European societies, had long prevailed across the 19th century. Especially in the late 19th century, many Eastern European Jews located in the area that now is Russia had to migrate from Eastern Europe because they were subjects of discrimination. At the same time, late 19th century, Vienna, for instance, that many of us admire as a place with unique cultural significance, have had an anti-Semitic mayor who thought that Austrian Jews should be rooted out of Germany, of Austria, excuse me. So anti-Semitism is not something new, but what happens with the Nazi regime is that it is being taken at greater lengths, at another level, if you will. The Jews are signaled out as the number one enemy of Germany within within the borders of the country, but also kind of ideas about Jewish conspiracies or capitalist conspiracies about the German nation proliferate. And the form of anti-Semitism that the Nazi regime brings forward is quite a violent one. And it's based on strong racial principles. And the iconic event where 1935 is the first moment when things get serious in the terms that they're written into law. 1938 is another turning point. It's the November 1938, the so-called Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. I would ask you if you were in class how many of you are familiar with this. Brutal riots against Jews all around Germany occur. Jewish homes and shops are attacked and demolished. At least 100 Jewish people die. 30,000 of them are deported to concentration camps, and I'll talk a bit about this in the third segment. The night of destruction is enacted by civilians, youth movements, and SA troops, which are the kind of paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party. German authorities, of course, do not intervene, and that creates a big wave of pretty much 1/4 of the Jewish population in Germany tries to migrate. Although, and that has to be said, other countries are at the time reluctant to accept them. At the same time, so that this happens, we need to be aware that for the Nazi regime, the idea of rooting out the Jew, as it were, connected with a wider view of how not only German society ought to be, but also what kind of new human should the German Third Reich create. Jews are deemed to be degenerate. Their various different aspects of their culture is being projected and displayed for everyone to see, but it's also forms of art that we talked about in the previous lectures, such as the Bauhaus, such as Surrealism, are also deemed to be degenerate. And here I'll have a little quote from Hitler in 1937, when he opens what he deems to be a proper museum to celebrate German art. And then he refers to all sorts of various avant-garde, modernist art movements at the time, such as Cubism, Futurism, Impressionism, and here I could add Surrealism, for instance. And they say that these kinds of movements that were, proliferating across Europe in the 20s, as we saw last time, are neither old or modern. but they're simply the stilted stammering of people to whom God has denied real artistic talent and has given instead the gift of blather and deception. I therefore wish to affirm, Hitler continues in this hour, my immutable resolve to do for German artistic life what I have done in the area of political confusion, to purge it of empty phrases. Works of art, he says, that cannot be understood on their own, but rather require a pompous user manual to justify their existence, will no longer find their way to German people. Remember here, right? I don't want to psychologize. It's not what we do as historians. Hitler was a failed artist himself. So he understood that what he saw the cultural mission and the political mission of the Third Reich to be was to purge national life from all sorts of degenerate elements. On the racial frontier, on the racial aspect, the Jews were the degenerates, and not only Jews, by the way, other kinds of minorities, such as homosexuals, such as Roma, etc. And at the same time, in the field of culture, it was these kinds of free experiments in artistic expression, these movements that really questioned human subjectivity. And the ideal in both cases was this new Aryan man that drew from classic motifs that harken back to the ancient sort of Greek classical depictions and scenes of statues, heroism, etc. So there was a move back to a certain view of neoclassicism for the Nazis to kind of foreground there what they thought that this new man, this new Aryan man that they wanted to create was. So it's important here to note that Aryanism was in as much as a political and a cultural project on the or with regards to what the Nazis were proclaiming to be doing. Now, in the next segment, I will move on to discussing the coming of the Second World War, some key events.